This is the second half of chapter 7 in the text. We ended the last section talking about retrieval. So to remind you, this is the process of transferring information from your long-term memory back into working memory. So the idea of recall, and we are bringing it into consciousness. And again, a reminder that most of our failures of memory are failures to retrieve rather than failures to encode those memories in the first place. The next few slides are going to talk about cued recall. So there are certain cues that we can use to help us retrieve information from long-term memory. And some of those include encoding, state-dependent learning. So we're going to talk about a few of those. So the first thing is that retrieval cues are most effective when created by the person who uses them. So when there were participants viewing a list of words, they were put into a couple of different groups. They generated retrieval cues on their own. So for example, I believe the textbook gives you the examples of bananas, and someone might have written yellow bunched fruit to remember bananas. And they were supposed to be retrieval cues that were specific to them. When they were retested, some of the words were the ones that they had used themselves, and other words were generated by the researchers, so they weren't necessarily the same cues. And then finally, there was another group of people who never saw the words in the first place, and when they looked at them, they only saw the cues, so it didn't matter if they were self-generated or other person-generated. And so you can see here that at that top level with the orange bar, that is the nouns that were remembered using the self-generated retrieval cues. And so when people generated their own cues, they performed better than if they were using cues from someone else. It also makes sense when we think about elaborate rehearsal and how, we are the ones providing a self-reference, or we are elaborating. It's easier to remember. There are also ways in which we retrieve better because we encode it in a specific way. So Baddeley's diving experiment was about place, so where you learned information. And this was actually a diving, like literal diving in the water. So we are looking here at two different types of study phases, either underwater or on land. And again, this was a list of words for recall. And then the test would happen either underwater or on land. And you can see the two that are brighter, on the left side, underwater, has 11.5 recalled versus 8.5. There was an effect there that if it was in the same place, there was increased retrieval for those words. And then same on the right side there, you can see that on land is a higher level than underwater. This shows you that this has been replicated in other ways. So it's not only the exact place where someone learned something, but also the situations and circumstances under which someone learns something. So the encoding could happen, if you look at section B, in a noisy environment versus a quiet environment. And again, at the retrieval phase, if it was the same circumstances or situation, the participants performed better. And then the state-dependent learning refers to your essentially emotional and mental state. So if your mood at encoding is a certain level, then you will perform better if you were in that same mood when you are trying to retrieve the information. So all of these are important for thinking about test taking, for example. So the place and the situation and your mood can affect all of that at the retrieval. Another memory tip involves distributed versus massed practice effect, and this has been demonstrated in a number of different experiments. It is difficult to maintain close attention throughout a long study session, and therefore, if you have a break, you are able to do a couple of things. One is memory consolidation, so we will talk about that very briefly in a moment, and also not having the interference from other things that you are trying to encode. Morris et al. Did an experiment on transfer appropriate processing. So this is similar to what we were learning about encoding and state-dependent learning. During this encoding phase, there were two different kinds of tasks, a meaning task and a rhyming task. So they had to make judgments about the meaning of a word, or they had to say whether something rhymed with the word. And then at retrieval, they had to do a rhyming test. And what this shows is that the results of the task were better for those that did the same type of encoding task. So you can see there it was 33% from meaning to rhyming, but when it was rhyming task to rhyming test, it was 49%. Consolidation is our next topic, and as I mentioned, for distributed versus the massed practice, there is a period of time where our new memories have to move into a more permanent state. So all of this is involved in long-term memory, but the memories that are most recent are in a fragile state until they are consolidated. So we are going to talk about two different types of consolidation: synaptic consolidation and systems consolidation, and we'll look at those more closely. This experiment by Muller and Pilzecker in 1900 was one of the earlier tests for memory consolidation. We didn't exactly know what was happening at the time, but what Muller and Pilzecker did know was that when there was a delay between the practice for a list of words and then a test was given for list one, people did better when they had that delay. When it was immediate, they didn't have time for consolidating the memories. Now, Hebb in 1948, so 48 years later, wanted to look at what was actually happening at the synaptic level. And what he discovered was that there is a neural record of experience in that the synaptic connections get stronger for certain memories as time passes. So as you retrieve the same memory over and over, the synaptic connections get stronger and therefore become more permanent. And that is called long-term potentiation, LTP. So that means that there is enhanced firing of neurons after repeated stimulation. And by stimulation, we also mean retrieval of that particular memory in this case. And it is a structural change. So you can see this illustrated here in the first illustration on the left. Neurotransmitters are being released from the end of one axon and going into the synaptic area. They are then being absorbed by the next axon, and the dendrites are being formed then by that third illustration on your right. There are actual structural changes that really enhance the connection and allow for faster transmission of the neurotransmitters. And you'll also see there that there's increased firing. So it's happening at a more rapid speed as well, causing that to be a more permanent memory. That is the synaptic level. This now is what we're looking at for the systems level. And the standard model of consolidation involves First, if you look at the illustration where it says areas of cortex and hippocampus, there are lots of connections between the cortex and the hippocampus. And so we know from many different studies that the hippocampus is involved in the initial encoding of memories into long-term memory. But from a systems approach, over time, the more that memory is accessed and the more that long-term potentiation happens, the less your cortex is relying on the hippocampus for that particular process. So you'll see at point C at the bottom, it says over time, connections are formed between cortical areas, and the connections between the hippocampus and cortex are weakened and eventually vanish. Just a couple of illustrations of the fragility of new memories, as we talked about. When someone has retrograde amnesia, a loss of memory for events prior to a trauma, it is typically the most recent memories that are lost because they have not had the time to be consolidated and made more permanent. Graded amnesia means that more memory for recent events is more fragile. And finally, the multiple trace hypothesis is one that questions that assumption. So we had originally said the hippocampus is involved at the beginning of consolidation, at that point of encoding into long-term memory. However, there are studies, Gilboa et al. And Viscontis, that found that the hippocampus is also involved at other times of retrieval of both remote and recent memories. Therefore, we do know that the hippocampus is involved in multiple stages of memory at this point. And we also know this from evidence from research on animals as well. So we are still really, you can look at this slide one more time. 2004 and 2009 are not that long ago when we're considering the last 100 years of this research. So it is very much still a work in progress to learn about the human memory. And in our next section, we're going to talk about everyday memory and some of the errors in memory that we make.